But we're going to continue our reading. And Male, Female, Other, A Catholic Guide to Understanding Gender. And as always, 2 book recommendations. The first is Ryan Anderson's book, When Harry Became Sally. And also Irreversible Damage by Abigail Schreier. Very good books. Definitely recommend reading through those. Very pertinent to our conversations. All right, so the claim that Jason Everett will be going over this evening is some people are trans. It is profoundly disrespectful and dismissive to deny the reality of transgender people. Just as no one questions the existence of cisgender individuals, it's unreasonable and uncharitable to pretend that people who are trans are any less real. When Christians make statements such as "no one is transgender," it makes trans individuals feel erased and unseen. That is the argument to be responded to this evening. There is no question that many individuals exist who experience gender dysphoria or identify in a way that does not align with their sex. But is there such thing as a trans person? Some individuals understandably feel offended that such a question would even be raised. In the words of trans YouTuber Samantha Lukes, quote, referring to trans women as masculine for no reason other than the fact that we were born male is just not necessary. This language is not appropriate. You cannot call us biological boys or even biological males and expect us to think that you're coming at us in good faith. That is the language of a transphobe, and you will be treated as such. Oh, that's quite interesting. Do they reject the fact that they have male biology? It's not quite clear here what is being said. I certainly wouldn't use the term biological males. There's only one type of male. But to question whether humans should be categorized as cis versus trans is not intended to imply that the lived experiences, which another redundant expression, of any individual who identifies as trans is fabricated or disingenuous. The question is intended to raise a profoundly important matter. What is it that defines a person? Do feelings or self-perception reveal the deepest truth of a person's identity? When a person claims that he or she is trans, it cements a feeling into an identity and an ontological status. Being trans is not an ontological status. It becomes who they are rather than what they feel. But if a person's identity hinges upon their feelings or beliefs, even if those experiences are persistent and deeply felt, the process of self-identification becomes unnecessarily difficult. If the body cannot be trusted to reveal the truth of the person, then why should feelings be trusted? For example, YouTuber Ash Hardell recommends that viewers experiment with different names, pronouns, and outfits to see what feels right. She suggests to her audience that they try different things, and then you can kind of figure out like what pings your euphoria, and then that is like a good way to figure out your gender and your gender identity, end quote. Other online influencers, such as Kaylee Carroll, propose that taking hormones is, quote, probably the best way to actually tell if you're trans anyways, end quote. But are such drastic measures necessary? 50 years ago, a young woman who had predominantly masculine interests would be labeled a tomboy. Now, with the evolution and power of language, she might conclude she is trans and would benefit from a double mastectomy because she was born in the wrong body. But something can be learned from history here. Is the better approach for such a woman to discard womanhood and appropriate manhood, or to broaden her cultural understanding of what it means to be a woman? Gender nonconformity does not require people to identify as something other than their sex. After all, everyone is either a male person or a female person. There is no subset of human beings for whom sex is irrelevant. By introducing the idea that some people are trans, gender theorists and other influencers are attempting to use language to shape reality by informing cultures how to think about it. In the words of Professor Judith Butler, quote, "The alteration of gender at the most fundamental epistemic level will be conducted, in part, through contesting the grammar in which gender is given," end quote. Or in the words of one trans activist, quote, "It's time for trans experience to move from being an object of knowledge to being one of its creators," end quote. If the trans identity becomes fundamental to one's thought, it becomes the lens through which life is understood. By redefining human identity, some have proposed that it then becomes possible to change language, philosophies, politics, and even science. However, what these ambitious thinkers fail to realize is that when God speaks, new realities are created. When humans speak, the only thing created is sound. This is a substantial ontological difference. As Dr. Abigail Favale explains, quote, "Divine speech makes reality, human speech identifies reality. Our language does not project meaning onto things. Rather, meaning intrinsically exists in what God creates. Moreover, this meaning is intelligible to us, and language, a mark of God's image in us, enables human beings to proclaim that inherent meaning. Therefore, humans cannot add the word trans as a prefix to another word and create a new reality. For example, a gentleman named Ali London identifies as transracial and has received 18 reconstructive surgeries to appear Korean. After a series of procedures, he announced, "I'm so happy finally. I've been trapped in the wrong body for 8 years, and that's the worst feeling in the world when you're trapped, and you don't feel like you can be yourself. But finally, I'm Korean. I can be myself, and I'm so happy." Similarly, some individuals experience species euphoria and identify as trans species. Take, for example, a man in the United Kingdom named Ted who identifies as a parrot. To become like them, he not only tattooed feathers onto his skin, but he had the whites of his eyes tattooed. He surgically removed his ears, transformed his house into a bird cage, and lives off the same food as the pets. He explained, quote, "You just cannot trust people like you can trust parrots," end quote. Some individuals might be offended by such comparisons. Although emotional reactions are sometimes justified, sometimes they are a mechanism to avoid responding to a difficult question. If transgender activists were asked, "Do you hate Ted or Oli?" the activists would likely deny any feelings of ill will, but the question becomes, then why can't these individuals transition to become another race or species so they could become their authentic selves? A libertarian reaction might be to endorse their right to augment their bodies according to their personal wishes. But does anyone believe that the deepest truth about these individuals is that they are transracial or transspecies? Such an identification does not bring them closer to the truth of who they are, but further away from it. In a similar way, when a person identifies as transgender, although this might provide them with a term that they feel helps them to talk about a complicated experience and communicate that to others, an important question must be asked. Does this title enable them to be their authentic self, or to reject the deepest truth of their identity? But differently, does it affirm the person, or the dysphoria? For these reasons, Dr. Deborah So argues, quote, there is no such thing as a transgender child. The stringing together of transgender and child is part of a lexicon pushed by activists to co-opt the young into their political movement. Many people, including parents, unknowingly use the term, not knowing there is a difference between being transgender and being gender dysphoric. As a result, some parents will make declarative statements such as, my daughter was born transgender. But one man who underwent reassignment surgery later observed, if you believe there are trans kids, you'll seek different solutions than if you believe there are children who suffer from gender dysphoria. What does it mean to be human? The philosopher Joseph Piper once said that it is impossible for a man to know the essence of a single gnat. If this is the case, then it is important to approach the subject of the human person with a posture of reverence and humility. Ultimately, man is a mystery. This does not mean, however, that we cannot know anything about man. It simply means that we cannot know everything about the subject. There is much that can be learned through the physical and psychological sciences, but without the contribution of divine revelation, we will arrive at an impartial picture of what it means to be human. St. John Paul II pointed out, though, quote, modern rationalism does not tolerate mystery. It does not accept the mystery of man as male and female. For ages, philosophers and scientists have grappled with the question of what it means to be human. Thousands of years ago, Gnostics and Manichaeans adopted a dualist view of the human person. In short, it is the creed that professes, I'm not my body. A similar philosophy was promoted by the French thinker René Descartes, whose idea of the human mind was summarized by others as the ghost in the machine. This view of the human person now serves as the foundation of gender theory, that if gender is tied to sex, the person becomes a slave to his or her body. As Robert P. George wrote, the idea that human beings are non-bodily persons inhabiting non-personal bodies never quite goes away. The Church's answer to this disintegration of the human person is an integrated vision of man. To the question, can we trust the body to reveal the truth of the person, the Church would utter an emphatic yes. The human body reveals the person. This teaching, rather than being an imposition from religious authorities, is something people naturally believe. For example, if you were to say, I am going to the store, it's safe to say that your body is going to be there as well. In other words, you don't have a body, you are a body. It's not something you merely have, like you have a pair of jeans. Your body is you. This is not to say that a person is the sum of his or her parts. A woman is not a woman because she has female parts merely. Rather, she has female parts because she is a woman. Because the body reveals the person, it is a visible expression of the reality of who you are as a man or woman. So instead of the materialistic idea that chromosomes plus gonads plus anatomy equals sex, the Church would propose that the human person is not a sexless being that has a male or female body. Rather, it is the human person, male or female, who is sexed, and this reality is expressed in and through the body. As St. John Paul II explained, it is typical of rationalism to make a radical contrast in man between spirit and body, between body and spirit. But man is a person in the unity of his body and his spirit. The body can never be reduced to mere matter. It is a spiritualized body, just as man's spirit is so closely united to the body that he can be described as an embodied spirit. End quote. In fact, the human body is the only creation of God that makes a person visible. Angels are personal beings, but they do not have a body. Animals have bodies, but they are not personal beings. They do not have souls. Therefore, the human body alone has the power to make visible and invisible reality of personhood. Put simply, your sex is not what you have, but who you are. Thus, a person's identity is revealed in and through the body, not by one's feelings about the body. If the body is a reliable revelation, this is good news. It means that the body is not meaningless, but meaningful. The body is the firm foundation of man's sexual identity. One's sex defines our identity, expresses the person, and reveals the soul. As Cardinal Christoph Schonborn declared, quote, "The beauty is real and reliable. Its light can be traced back to God's original guiding intention for man and woman." What many people overlook is that the devil is not only the enemy of the soul, he is the enemy of human nature. What God has joined, he desires to separate. So if God has joined together a husband and wife, the devil seeks divorce. If God has united the body to the soul, the devil desires their division, which is death. But if the devil can rupture the union that exists between the body and the person, the image of God becomes obscured. After all, if the body is meaningless, then so are the terms man, wife, father, daughter, and family. Contrary to what many believe, gender theory does not aim to create an endless spectrum of genders, but to abolish sexual differences. The ultimate goal is to erase what St. John Paul II called the spousal meaning of the body. After all, for diversity to exist, there must be objective differences. However, the ultimate diversity is male and female, because we are a sexually dimorphic species. This might strike some as an apocalyptic exaggeration, but consider the testimony of the family of Robert Arquette. Robert was an American actor who identified as trans and passed away in 2016. After Robert's death, his family released the following statement, quote, "Our brother Robert, who became our brother Alexis, who became our sister Alexis, who became our brother Alexis, passed this morning. In the days leading to her death, she told us she was already visiting the other side, and that where she was going there was only one gender. That on the other side we are free from all the things that separate us in this life, and that we are all one." That sounds a bit pantheistic. It's not uncommon. There's a bar close to where I live. They do drag shows. They celebrate same-sex marriage. And I notice now they have on their sign stuff about Wicca. The thing is, often Satan will lead us to believe that we need to separate ourselves from the divisions that God made within nature. And we need to unify ourselves in a way contrary to what God established, which is a complete inversion of Christianity. Christianity is that God is the one who separates us and we resign to nature, and that we do not become one with God in heaven. But rather, we do not recognize that we're all one. We continue to recognize the distinction between me and somebody else, because that's how God made it, and the distinction between us and God. We're not going there to become God or recognize that we are God and then worship ourselves. We are there to worship the one true God and to see him face to face, who is beauty, goodness, and truth itself, and the beatific vision. What perhaps most fascinating about this statement is not the fluidity of Robert's gender identity and expression, But the idea that sexual differences separate men and women, and that the solution to this division is to eliminate such distinctions. St. John Paul II proposed a very different perspective of sexual difference. In his Theology of the Body, he proposes that the spousal meaning of the body is the fundamental truth about the human person. In order to understand what it means to be human, one must understand this. It means that the human body has the power to express the love by which the human person becomes a gift, thus fulfilling the deep meaning of his or her being and existence. End quote. He adds that the spousal meaning of the body is, quote, the spiritual beauty of the sign constituted by the human body in its masculinity and femininity, end quote. What he means by this is that humans are made in the image and likeness of God, who is love. Therefore, the human person images God not merely in a spiritual way or as individuals, but most profoundly in his complementarity as male and female. He writes, God becomes an image of God not so much in the moment of solitude as the moment of communion. This constitutes perhaps the deepest theological aspect of everything one can say about man. In the one flesh union of husband and wife, the two make visible the invisible mystery of God, that the Blessed Trinity is a communion of persons, an eternal exchange of life-giving love. Therefore, the sexual difference has a transcendent meaning that points beyond the individual. As Christopher West explained, quote, our bodies as male and female are not only biological, they are theological, end quote. Our bodies not only reveal something about us, who we are, and that we are called to make a difference, a gift of ourselves in love, they reveal something about God, in whose image we are made. This, St. John Paul said, can be said to sum up the whole of Christian anthropology, that man becomes fully himself to the extent that he gives himself as a free gift to others. But if the human body is a sign that makes visible the invisible mystery of God, then what happens if the sign is obscured? If man loses sight of God, he loses sight of himself. In the words of Vatican II, quote, when God is forgotten, the creature itself grows unintelligible. In other words, if man loses sight of supernatural realities, it will come to the point where man can no longer see natural realities. G.K. Chesterton predicted that such times would come. He wrote, quote, the great march of mental destruction will go on. Everything will be denied. Fires will be kindled to testify that 2 and 2 make 4. Swords will be drawn to prove that leaves are green in summer. If obscuring the sign of masculinity and femininity causes man's vision of God to be eclipsed, consider what happens when masculinity and femininity are lived out according to God's plan. Sexual difference would not reveal competition but complementarity. Sexual difference would not be viewed as the cause of oppression, but the revelation of life-giving love. It would not be an obstacle to unity, but rather the invitation to communion. Although it's common to speak of the opposite sex, male and female are not opposites or simply two types of bodies. Male and female are two ways of being made in the image of God. The other is not just another sex, but the other sex. The sexed body reveals that the human person is from others and for others. Without this complementarity, where does the body point? What is the natural complement to a person who is non-binary or gender fluid? Without sexual differentiation, we deprive ourselves of our own identity and knowledge of self. In the words of Pope Francis, learning to accept our body, to care for it, and to respect its fullest meaning is an essential element of our genuine human ecology. Also, valuing one's own body in its femininity or masculinity is necessary if I am going to be able to recognize myself in an encounter with someone who is different. End quote. What he means is that we only understand our own sexed reality when we accept and encounter the reality of the other sex. When that is erased, so are we. Masculinity and femininity, although expressed in various ways through history and cultures, are ordered toward an end: spousal union and parenthood. However, the truth of sexual difference does not require men and women to fit into narrow cultural expectations of gender. In fact, there are many ways for individuals to express the natural reality of our sex identities as male and female. Take, for example, Sister Deirdre Byrne, who is a missionary religious sister, a board-certified family practitioner and surgeon, and a colonel in the United States Army. She is well aware that she has more than one way of a woman to express her femininity. She did not do these things instead of motherhood. Rather, she mothered through these things. In the words of St. Edith Stein, quote, "Thus the participation of women in the most diverse professional disciplines could be a blessing for the entire society, private or public, precisely if the specifically feminine ethos would be preserved." Dr. Abigail Favale added, St. John Paul II's unique understanding of the terms masculinity and femininity could be helpful here. He uses these terms exclusively in reference to males and females, respectively. Masculinity is simply the way of being a man in the world, and is thus uniquely inflected by each individual personality. Thus, when my husband Michael is caring for our children and cooking dinner, these are masculine acts, because they are being performed by a male human being. Similarly, my femininity is exhibited as much in my assertiveness during a staff meeting as when I am breastfeeding, because it is the person who is gendered, not the act or trait. This embodied personalist understanding of masculinity and femininity reaffirms the meaning of the sex to body without collapsing cultural stereotypes into natural categories. This insight leaves room for the expansion of gender expression without erasing the binary nature of sex. So rather than saying that a woman is masculine if she engages in things that men typically engage in, is it possible she could change the oil in her car in a feminine way? Does she cease to be a woman if she expresses her femininity in a manner that stretches cultural expectations of womanhood? After all, a woman doesn't become one by having stereotypical female interests and mannerisms. If a person does not feel at home in his or her body, the Church would not conclude that the person is trans. Rather, the Church believes that original sin obscured humanity's ability to see themselves, others, and God. St. John Paul II explained that in the beginning, because of her original innocence, the man and woman were able to see one another as God sees them. The body was a clear revelation of the person and thus of one's call to love. But with original sin came shame and the desire to conceal the body. The Pope noted that this resulted in, quote, the collapse of the original acceptance of the body as a sign of the person in the visible world, end quote. Original sin disrupted not only the unity between men and women, but also the unity within each person. John Paul pointed out that this, quote, brings with it an almost constitutive difficulty in identifying oneself with one's own body, end quote. Although he was not addressing the question of gender dysphoria in this passage, the fact remains that each person, in his or her own way, experiences a division between the body and soul. Speaking of Adam after the fall, John Paul continued, quote, It is as if he had experienced a specific fracture of the personal integrity of his own body, particularly in that which determines its sexuality. Unquote. Every person will experience this challenge in a unique way, but each person is given a task to rediscover the meaning of his or her body. Whereas gender theory considers feelings of gender incongruence to be a guide that should be followed toward fulfillment, claiming to offer people the ability to embrace the full truth of their identity, a bold question that was asked above must be revisited. What if gender theory only gives people permission to reject it? What if the church's goal isn't to erase someone's identity, but to help them rediscover it? What if the church's hope is to help the individuals avoid the challenging question that Karina Cohen once posed, quote, "Why did I need to become a lifelong medical patient and have a dangerous surgery to reveal my authentic self?" These questions are not easy ones, but they explain why feminist philosopher Lucy Irigaray once wrote, quote, "Sexual difference is one of the important questions of our age, if not in fact the burning issue. According to Heidegger, each age is preoccupied with one thing, and one alone. Sexual difference is probably that issue in our own age, which could be our salvation on our intellectual level. Ultimately, sexual identity is not something we define, but something we receive. It is a gift from God." Hey, Zuckerberg, I'll be with you in a second. As St. John Paul II explained, the fundamental fact of this existence of man in every stage of his history is that God created them male and female. In fact, he always creates them in this way, and they are always such. End quote. Therefore, the question is not simply what makes you a man or a woman, but who makes you a man or a woman. It is not merely something that establishes our sexual identity, but someone. That concludes our reading. The